The auditorium at Westridge University was packed. It wasn't just another panel, it was the annual Voices of Change event where professors, public figures, and students gathered to discuss culture, politics, and generational shifts. Cameras rolled, microphones dangled above, faculty lined the front row. It was supposed to be an open dialogue, but something in the air already felt one-sided. Sitting in the second row was a freshman named Emily Cross. She wore a modest blue sweater, her notes carefully highlighted. Emily was soft-spoken, raised in a conservative household, and majoring in political science. When the moderator opened the floor for questions, she hesitated, then stood up. Her voice, though calm, carried into the microphone. "Professor Alden, you mentioned that traditional values are outdated and harmful. But what about people like me who still believe in them? Are we wrong to hold on to faith, family, and personal responsibility?" The room stiffened. A few students laughed quietly. The moderator shifted in his seat. Professor Henry Alden, a tenured scholar known for his sharp wit and progressive views, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Emily," he said with a smirk, "your beliefs aren't dangerous. They're just adorable, like clinging to a bedtime story long after you've outgrown it." Laughter erupted. Emily flushed. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the mic. "And as for faith," Alden continued, "I'm not here to debate fairy tales. This is a university, not Sunday school." The blow landed hard. Cameras caught every word. The crowd wasn't just entertained, they were emboldened. And Emily? She sat down, shrinking into her chair, eyes blinking rapidly to hold back the tears. But not everyone laughed. Sitting quietly near the back, Karoline Leavitt's posture straightened. She had arrived just minutes before, unannounced. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer, her cross necklace resting against her blouse, she watched the exchange with growing focus. She didn't know Emily personally, but she knew that look, the feeling of being silenced, not for being wrong, but for daring to speak. Karoline stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. But when she walked toward the microphone, the air changed. Even Alden tilted his head, surprised. The moderator hesitated. "Miss Karoline Leavitt," she said evenly. "Press secretary, former congressional candidate, and someone who still believes in bedtime stories, because some of them turn out to be true." A hush fell across the room, and Emily looked up, eyes wide, heart racing. She wasn't alone anymore. The microphone barely caught the breath Karoline took before speaking. The room, moments earlier filled with snickers and murmurs, now held a heavy silence. Even the camera operators leaned closer. Professor Alden folded his arms, half amused. "And what bedtime story would that be, Miss Leavitt?" Karoline didn't blink. "The one where truth still matters. The one where young women get to ask questions without being ridiculed by the very people who claim to stand for open discourse." A few students sat back in their chairs. Others glanced awkwardly at each other. Alden's smirk faded slightly. "I came here to listen," Karoline continued, her voice level but firm. "But what I just witnessed wasn't education. It was elitism dressed in a lecture coat." She turned, scanning the crowd. "Universities are meant to challenge ideas, not humiliate people for having them." Emily, still sitting in the second row, looked up. Her hands were still trembling, but something had shifted in her eyes. The weight of embarrassment began to lift, replaced by a flicker of awe. Karoline walked slowly across the stage. Her movements were measured, not theatrical. She didn't need volume to command attention. She had clarity. "You say traditional values are outdated," she said, facing Alden, "but millions of Americans still build their lives on them. Faith, responsibility, family, discipline. Are they less human because they disagree with you?" Professor Alden opened his mouth, but Karoline didn't give him the chance. "You call her beliefs fairy tales. Let me ask you something, Professor. If those beliefs got her through grief, kept her grounded, gave her hope, who are you to laugh at that?" A ripple of discomfort spread through the room. Some of the students who had laughed earlier now looked down at their shoes. Karoline's tone softened, but not her conviction. I've stood at the White House podium. I've been screamed at, mocked, labeled, but I never silenced anyone for disagreeing with me. I answered, because that's what real dialogue looks like. Then she looked at Emily. You asked a respectful question. You deserved a respectful answer. The audience held its breath. Karoline turned back to Alden. The power of a professor isn't in shaming students, it's in equipping them. And today, you chose power over purpose. Professor Alden's face had gone pale. He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was earned. And somewhere in the room, the first clap began. The first clap came from the back of the room. Software hesitant, but it was enough. Then came a second, and a third. Within seconds, the silence collapsed under the weight of applause. It wasn't the roaring kind that comes from excitement. It was the kind that builds slowly, like people waking up to something they didn't know they needed to hear. Emily looked around, stunned. Students who had laughed at her minutes ago were now standing. Some of them still looked uncertain, but they were standing. For her. For what Karoline had just done. Professor Alden stood frozen behind the podium, his fingers pressed together. He cleared his throat and tried to speak, but the clapping didn't stop. He waited, awkwardly adjusting his notes. Still, no one sat down. Karoline didn't revel in the attention. She stepped back from the mic, folded her hands, and glanced briefly toward Emily with a faint but reassuring smile. The moderator leaned in again, trying to reclaim control. Thank you, Miss Leavitt. But perhaps we should return to... Karoline gently cut him off. You brought me here for dialogue. Let's have it. She turned back to Alden. You speak of progress, Professor, but it's not progress to dismiss faith as ignorance. It's prejudice in disguise. And if this institution truly values voices of change, then it should start by listening, even to those it finds inconvenient. That hit hard. The student body had heard plenty of lectures before, but this wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't filtered. It was real. A student from the front row raised her hand. Can I say something? The moderator nodded hesitantly. I don't agree with Karoline on everything, she said, but she's right. What happened to Emily wasn't fair. I felt it in my gut, and I laughed anyway. I just want to say, I'm sorry. Emily's eyes welled up. She gave a slight nod in return, and just like that, the room wasn't just changed. It was alive. Students began raising their hands. Some had questions. Some just wanted to admit they'd been silent too long. Karoline listened, answered, challenged, but never mocked. In the corner, a young man whispered to a friend, I came here expecting a speech. I didn't know I'd watch someone flip the whole room. Professor Alden sat back down. The man who once commanded the conversation was now just a guest in it. And Karoline? She hadn't just spoken. She had sparked something no one saw coming. Karoline stepped aside to let the students speak. It wasn't about taking over. It was about giving space where silence had been imposed. The microphone passed between voices, some shaky, others bold. Most had never spoken in a public forum before. But now, something in the atmosphere made them feel they could. I've been afraid to speak up in class, said one sophomore, a young man in a baseball cap. I didn't want to be labeled backward just because I go to church. A girl in a gray hoodie nodded. I don't even consider myself religious, but what happened to Emily? That wasn't education. That was performance. Each voice built upon the next, and Karoline stood quietly at the side, arms folded, absorbing each word. At the center of it all sat Emily, still processing. Her cheeks were flushed, but no longer from shame. For the first time, she wasn't shrinking. She was listening, heart pounding, but chin up. Every comment that acknowledged what she'd been through lifted something off her shoulders. At the table, Professor Alden glanced at his notes. But they were useless now. His authority wasn't gone, but it was visibly cracked. His face betrayed something rarely seen in his lectures. Doubt. Karoline turned toward him. Professor, You still have the mic. If you'd like to respond respectfully, we're all listening. The challenge was clean, professional, and impossible to sidestep. Alden took a breath. His voice had lost its edge. I believe in pushing students to think critically, he said, quieter than before. But perhaps I forgot that respect is part of that process. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the first time he hadn't followed his own script. Karoline nodded. That's a start. The moderator finally smiled, tension easing from his shoulders. Well, he said, this may be the first panel we've had where disagreement actually turned into dialogue. Laughter. Real laughter. Not mocking. Not cruel. Emily whispered to the girl beside her, Did that really just happen? The girl grinned. Yeah, and you started it. Karoline turned back to the audience, now re-energized and engaged. Ideas deserve scrutiny, but people deserve dignity. She paused, her voice gentle now. We don't have to agree to be kind, and we don't have to be loud to be strong. Somewhere in the middle row, a student wiped away a tear. Karoline didn't just defend one student, she reminded the room of something it had forgotten. Courage isn't always about speaking louder. Sometimes it's about standing taller so someone else can find their voice. The panel concluded with polite applause and murmurs of disbelief. No one had expected a guest appearance to reshape the entire event, but Karoline had done exactly that. As students filed out, a few paused to thank her. Others walked straight to Emily, offering apologies, encouragement, even asking for her notes on the question she had tried to ask. The professor stayed behind, busying himself with papers he didn't really need to sort. His confidence had been tempered, his certainty fractured, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Emily remained seated as the room cleared, still stunned. Her thoughts whirled, heart racing, not with fear this time, but adrenaline. What had just happened? Just an hour ago, she had felt invisible. Now, people were coming to her, listening. Karoline approached slowly and sat beside her. You okay? She asked. Emily nodded. I think so. I don't know what that was. Karoline smiled gently. That was what truth looks like when you refuse to sit quietly. Emily's lips parted like she was about to cry. Thank you. You don't have to thank me, Karoline replied. You were brave enough to ask the question. That takes more courage than most people realize. Emily looked down at her notebook. Her fingers tightened around it. I thought I messed up. I thought I shouldn't have said anything. Karoline leaned closer. That's what they want you to think. That questioning is dangerous. That doubt makes you weak. But it doesn't. It makes you strong. If someone tries to silence you for being curious, they're not a teacher. They're a performer. Emily blinked, then let out a shaky breath. I didn't know anyone would stand up for me. Karoline looked her straight in the eyes. You won't always have someone to do that. But after today, I think you'll stand up for yourself. And maybe someone else too. Outside the auditorium, students still lingered. Conversations sparked, debates resumed, but now they were real. There was no more mocking laughter, no more smirks hiding behind titles. Something had changed. Later that evening, photos from the panel began surfacing online. Clips of Karoline's speech circulated. The moment she said, "We don't have to agree to be kind," racked up thousands of shares in just a few hours. Hashtags like "We are student voices," "Respect over ridicule," and "Karoline at Westridge" trended across platforms. But Emily didn't care about the internet. What mattered was how she felt now, seen, heard, and for the first time since arriving at Westridge University, strong. By morning, the ripple effect had become a wave. Westridge University's online forum, usually a quiet corner for student event recaps, was overwhelmed with new threads. Some defended Professor Alden, claiming he was misunderstood. But more voices, many previously silent, spoke out with stories of being laughed at in class, dismissed for asking the wrong kinds of questions, or penalized for personal beliefs. One comment read, "I watched that girl get humiliated last night. I stayed quiet. I won't again." Another, "Never heard of Karoline Leavitt before." But that's what leadership looks like. Karoline, meanwhile, wasn't glued to social media. She was already preparing for her next meeting across town, sipping coffee in a quiet cafe corner. Her phone buzzed endlessly. Calls from journalists, messages from young women saying thank you, and an unexpected voicemail from a professor at another university. "Your words gave me courage to speak up in my own department. I didn't think that was still possible." But Karoline didn't need attention. What mattered most to her was that Emily had found her voice, and that others might too. At Westridge, Emily returned to campus like a different person. She walked with her shoulders back. Some students nodded to her in passing. A few even asked to study together. The girl who had once whispered in lecture halls now spoke with quiet conviction. One afternoon, Emily was invited to join a student panel, this time not as a spectator, but as a speaker. She hesitated. Could she really stand in front of a crowd after what happened? She remembered Karoline's words, "You won't always have someone to stand up for you." So she said yes. That night she stood at the same podium where she'd once felt so small. Her hands shook, but her voice held. "I thought speaking up was a mistake," she told the crowd. "But silence would have been worse." A video of her speech found its way online. The comment section flooded again. "She's the reason I changed majors. She's what Westridge needed. Thank you for being brave, Emily." Back at her hotel, Karoline watched the clip alone. She didn't smile like someone watching her own success. She smiled like someone who'd just seen a seed grow. One voice had been nearly erased, but now it had multiplied. With every wave of support came a tide of backlash. As Emily's video climbed into the trending lists, critics emerged, both online and inside the university halls. Some professors accused Karoline of politicizing a campus event. One faculty member wrote a scathing op-ed in the student newspaper. "Westridge should be a place of progressive ideals, not a stage for outdated conservatism dressed as courage." The word outdated echoed in Karoline's mind. She had heard it before. She expected it, but she also knew what it meant. They were rattled. At Westridge, Emily felt the weight of this pushback more directly. One of her political science professors, coincidentally, removed her from a student-led project. Another stopped calling on her in class. In private, students whispered that she was Karoline's little project. She felt isolated again, but this time, she didn't retreat. When a campus reporter asked her if she regretted speaking up, Emily simply replied, "Not for a second." Karoline, sensing the shift, returned to Westridge unannounced. She requested a meeting with the university president. At first, she was ignored, so she wrote a letter, open and unflinching. She included student testimonials, time-stamped recordings, and legal citations regarding viewpoint discrimination in public universities. The letter was published the next day. It didn't just make headlines, it caused meetings to be canceled, emails to be sent, and public statements to be drafted. Faculty lines were drawn. But one truth was undeniable. A student had been mocked, a guest had restored the balance, and now neither could be ignored. Back on campus, Karoline walked beside Emily through the quad. Students passed them, some waving, some avoiding eye contact. The campus felt different now, not fully changed, but undeniably stirred. "You started something here," Karoline said, glancing at her. Emily nodded. "I'm going to finish it." Karoline grinned. "That's the spirit." Just then, a group of first-year students approached them. "Miss Leavitt, can we ask you something?" one of them said nervously. Karoline turned to them warmly. "Of course." They hesitated, then asked, "How do you speak with that much strength when the room wants to shut you down?" Karoline looked at them. "You remember why you're speaking in the first place. If it's only for applause, you'll quit when it's quiet. But if it's for something bigger, you'll keep going, even if you're the only one standing." Emily looked over. This time, she didn't just hear the words. She felt them. And she knew they weren't just Karoline's anymore. They were hers, too. Weeks passed, but the impact didn't fade. What began as one insult and one defense had become a quiet but steady movement across campuses nationwide. Clips of Karoline's speech, and more importantly, Emily's second panel appearance, were being shared at universities far beyond Westridge. Other students, some in Texas, others in Michigan, even as far as Oregon, sent Emily messages. "I watched your panel. I asked a question in class today I was too afraid to ask last month. My professor mocked my values too. Now I know I'm not alone. You reminded me why I chose this path." Emily began to write more, speak more, and even created a student forum for civil debate. A place where political and ideological lines weren't walls but bridges. And she didn't do it alone. She did it with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her voice and refused to let it be silenced again. Karoline returned one final time for a formal university event, a moderated roundtable titled Free Speech in Academia. Professor Alden was present, this time not as a dominant figure, but as a panelist among equals. Karoline didn't attack him. She didn't mock him. Instead, she told a story. She spoke of being silenced herself at 22, of being called names on national TV, of being told she was too young, too idealistic, too loyal. "I wasn't offended," she said. "I was motivated, because I knew the people who tried to silence me weren't afraid of my words. They were afraid of what my words represented." A student in the audience leaned in. "Which was?" the moderator asked. Karoline smiled softly. "Conviction. The kind they couldn't control." She turned to Emily. "And that's what I saw that day. Conviction in a question, and courage in a response." Alden nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in respect. Emily closed her notebook. She didn't need notes anymore. Later that night, Karoline and Emily stood outside the event hall beneath the quiet glow of lamplight. "You know," Karoline said, "they'll keep pushing back." Emily looked up. "Then we'll keep showing up." Karoline smiled. "You're not just a student anymore. You're a force." They shook hands, mentor to leader. The spark had become a fire. And now, it was lighting paths far beyond that one university hall. What began as a local incident had now become a national conversation. Major networks replayed the video of Karoline's first speech at Westridge. Commentators debated it endlessly. Some called her a political disruptor in heels. Others dismissed it as conservative theater. But none could deny one thing: people were listening. Emily received an invitation from a National Student Coalition to speak at their annual summit in D.C. She nearly declined. "I'm not ready," she told Karoline. Karoline replied simply, "You already did it once, without preparation. Now imagine what you'll do with it." So Emily went. She stood at the podium facing a crowd of over 2,000 college students, faculty, and media. Her voice shook at first, but only for a moment. "I didn't want to be an activist," she began. "I wanted to be a student. But when your questions make people uncomfortable, you realize being a student is activism." The room fell still. "I was humiliated in front of my peers for asking a question," she continued. "And if Karoline Leavitt hadn't stood up that day, I might never have spoken again." She paused, her eyes moving across the crowd. "But she didn't just defend me. She reminded me that my voice wasn't a liability. It was a responsibility." Karoline watched from the audience. For once, she didn't want the spotlight. This moment belonged to Emily. After the speech, young women lined up to speak to her. Some hugged her. Some just said, "Thank you." One girl, barely older than 17, whispered, "I used to think I had to choose between my beliefs and belonging. Now I know I can have both." The next morning, an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal called Emily a rare voice of courage in a culture of fear. The headline read, "When a student spoke and a nation heard." Westridge's administration, once hesitant, now began instituting real policy changes, clear protections for viewpoint diversity in classrooms, anonymous reporting channels, and a faculty-led task force for respectful discourse. Back on campus, Emily sat at her usual spot on the quad. Not alone this time. A small circle of students joined her, openly discussing topics that once felt untouchable. Karoline, watching from a nearby bench, couldn't help but smile. Not because her name was trending, but because someone else's name, someone younger, quieter, braver, was now being remembered for something that actually mattered. And for the first time, Karoline saw her reflection in someone else, not just as a mentor, but as the proof that everything she'd fought for was beginning to bloom. A month later, Westridge University unveiled a new student initiative, the Free Exchange Forum. It was founded by Emily Cross and supported by a diverse range of students, from liberal to conservative, atheist to devout. Its goal? To promote civil debate, not cancellation, to ask hard questions without fear of ridicule. Karoline was invited back to the university, not for a panel, not for a confrontation, but for a celebration. She arrived in a simple blazer, her signature cross necklace resting quietly beneath her collar, the way it always had. But this time, it wasn't her words that people were quoting. It was Emily's. Posters across campus read, "Being a student is not about knowing everything. It's about being brave enough to ask." Emily Cross. That day, Karoline and Emily stood together on a modest stage in front of the forum's first official gathering. Students from rival clubs, differing ideologies, and all walks of life filled the room, not to shout over one another, but to actually listen. Karoline stepped forward to speak one last time. "I didn't come here to build a platform for myself," she said. "I came here because one student, just one, stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent. And because of her courage, this university found its voice again." The room fell quiet. We are not here to agree. We are here to think and to listen, and to remember that disagreement is not a threat, it's a test of character. She turned to Emily. "And you, Emily, passed with grace." The room stood in applause, not just for Karoline, but for a culture shift that no professor, pundit, or politician had been able to achieve. After the event, Karoline walked toward the parking lot alone. A breeze tugged gently at her hair. She didn't need cameras or interviews anymore. She had done what she came to do. Behind her, Emily stayed behind with a dozen students still talking, still debating, but this time with respect, with curiosity. The flame Karoline had sparked now burned in others. And somewhere far away, another young woman, watching a video clip from her dorm, sat a little taller, ready to ask the question everyone told her not to. Because of a story. Because of a voice. Because of Karoline. Some voices are born loud, others must fight to be heard. In a room where silence was expected and conformity rewarded, one young student dared to ask a question. She was mocked, dismissed, laughed at. But then, someone stood up. Karoline Leavitt didn't just defend her. She shifted the entire conversation. She reminded a university, and perhaps a nation, that courage isn't about volume. It's about conviction. This story isn't just about Emily or Karoline. It's about what happens when one person refuses to bow to pressure, and instead raises her voice for someone else. Because true leadership doesn't just speak. It listens, it lifts, and sometimes it walks into the fire, so others will dare to stand. At Westridge University, a spark became a fire, and now the silence will never return.